has to be something different, because we did everything. We pointed out everything. Now, what the Troy Davis case revealed is that there is a whole population out there, tens of thousands of people when you look at it, who are seriously affected in this country by their loved ones being sentenced to death. And I'm the founding member of an organization called FACE. FACE stands for Families of America's Condemned Empowered. FACE believes that the death penalty is, when we borrow a term from the military, is collateral. The death penalty has collateral damage. The military is always talking about how it tries to lessen collateral damage. However, the fact of the matter is, the loved ones of people in the death house go through traumatic trauma every day that that person is in the death house. And the Troy Davis case brought that out. Troy's mother passed in her sleep, an otherwise healthy woman, in her sleep. Shortly after he was denied the innocence hearing. Troy was in prison 21 years. Shortly after the innocence hearing. And then Troy himself, and then Martina. We mentioned, we briefly mentioned Reggie Clemens. Last month we had an event at City College, and his mother and father came. And I was talking about this, and his father stood up, who's a minister, and he pointed to another family in Missouri, where 4 members of that family passed, directly related to the stress that having a loved one in the death house brings to bear. So a part of what the struggle must be now has to be putting first and foremost the people who have the most interest in the forefront of the struggle to end the death penalty, and that is the families. The families of America's condemned must be in the forefront of the struggle to end the death penalty. That is, well, FACE is working on 3 basic areas. FACE is looking at getting counseling for the families of men and women in the death house. FACE is looking at organizing these families, to organize the community, you see, and then unite together and to eventually start their own legal proceedings. Because the reality is that if the state does not recognize that it is cruel and unusual for the defendant to be executed, then it has to recognize that the collateral impact on the families is just too much. It most definitely is cruel and unusual. And we're trying to do some studies to correlate the effects that the death penalty has on the families of men and women in the death house. I mean, having said that, what time? Where are we at, huh? I got time? Jesus Christ. Oh, hey. I just want to tell you a little about my own case, right? And why I'm so, passionate about this issue. At 18 years old, I joined the Black Panther Party. 17, 18 years old, I joined the Black Panther Party. I used to set up breakfast programs, clothing programs. I used to come right up here to the Black Studies, to learn Black Studies, Black history, and take it back and teach it to young African-American children in my neighborhood, which Ocean Hill Brownsville. A lot of people don't know, you hear Black Panther Party, oh, that racist, because, all right, no. The programs we set up came out of Brown versus Board of Education, and the work done by John Henry Clark, who said, well, you know, you send children to school hungry, then they're less likely to learn. If you send them to school in tattered clothing, you know, they're embarrassed and they're less likely to learn. If you send them to school and they look in the books and can't see themselves, you know, they're less likely to learn, less likely to take interest, because they don't see themselves at the end of the heroes and the leaders of America and the technicians and the, you know. So this is what I did. And I had an after-school program in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, at Eyes 55 and 271, where I taught basic martial arts. All right. So this is what I did. And then mid to late 1969, I was approached and asked would I get involved in a unit, a cell, whose specific responsibilities were to rid the African American community of drugs, heroin. I was introduced to a gentleman who said that he used to work for mafioso families. As a courier, he used to carry drugs from one place, drugs and money from one place to the next place. So he knew what was called drop spots, where drugs and money meet at the same time. And so I'm idealistical, yeah, we're gonna do this, you know, fist and all, that's right. And so we went after it, and we did about between 1969, 1971, we did about 5 or 6 of these we call them raids. We were very, very careful on raids, not robberies, raids, because we would identify, we would do surveillance, we would execute, and we would take the drugs and destroy them in front of the people that we took them from. And we would take the money and filter it back. Well, stuff got a little twisted, you know, money get involved, things get a little twisted. You know, because money did find its way into people's pockets, but I mean, hey, that's the reality of existence. So anyway, that's what we used to do. On one occasion, on August 21st, 1971, the same evening that George Jackson was murdered at Soledad Prison, two of my comrades went into a delicatessen. You'd be surprised where drugs and money change hands. You know, they went in to do surveillance. I heard gunshots. I ran to the door. My comrade bumped up against me and grunted, so I knew something was wrong with my effect. But my eyes was fixed upon a gentleman in front of me. He had a gun pointed at me, and I just saw my life in that flash go. You know, however, instead of pulling the trigger, as I'm observing him, and I'm telling you this is happening like this, as I'm observing him, a spot of blood appears in his forehead, and he falls to the ground. He pitches forward and falls to the ground. My attention now is on my comrade who I heard fall as I'm looking at this, and I turned around and looked at him. I ran over to him and bent down, and the tree in front of us exploded with gunfire. I worked my way around the tree. During my training, I was told everybody, but mainly people with guns, cowards, are cowards. So if they're shooting at you and you shoot back, they're gonna duck. And when they duck, you have anywhere from 7 to 10 seconds to move. And they were shooting at me. I looked at my car, I was around the tree, I looked at my car, and my comrade was still alive. He had been shot in the shoulder. He was still alive. And I figured, you know, the heroics, maybe we'd break him out of jail. I thought, you know, I'm still young, so I had all these emotions, you know. We're gonna break him out of jail, or, you know, get behind him somehow. Now, I don't know this guy in the delicatessen, he's a police officer. I don't know this, you know. However, I reach over, I grab his gun, I shoot in the air. I first identified what's called a shadow, I duck into the shadow. When I fire a gun, I duck into the shadow, and I'm looking for shadows from there, and I got away. Right? You shoot, they duck, you move, they think you're still there when they come up. That's not that good. Anyway, I was caught at the Canadian border. 2 weeks later, I was taken to a state trooper barracks in Plattsburgh. I was beaten. I'm sure I was drugged too, because I know that I was being beaten, and all I could do was see stuff. I couldn't feel, I could see. And I saw hands coming at me. I went unconscious, unconscious. I don't know how long they beat. All I know, 2 days later, I wake up, I'm coming off a plane at LaGuardia Airport. I go to trial. I have an all-white jury, all-male, average age 55 out of Queens County. In 1971, believe me, that meant a lot. I'm convicted. I'm sentenced to death. A year after I'm in the death house, the district attorney in my case was disbarred for taking bribes from organized criminals. A year and a half after I'm in the death house, the judge in my case is cited in a New Yorker magazine article by investigative article by Jack Newman as being one of the 10 worst judges in New York State because of his favoritism to organized criminals. It was later learned that the lawyer who was assigned to me was a lawyer who frequented organized crime clients. Wow. While I was in the death house, I started studying law. I got a hold of my transcripts, my trial transcripts, and among that was the autopsy report for my comrade. The autopsy report read that he had bruises and contusions from head to toe, that almost every bone in his body was broken, was fractured, broken, or bruised, that he had a hole in his head the size of a grapefruit. So they murdered him after they came. They found out this was a police officer, and they hit him, they punched him, they beat him with batons, and one of them kicked him inside the head with those steel-toe boots and crushed his skull. I didn't get out like that. I got out because of Fern University, Georgia. She indicated that. So understand something. And another thing, the integrity of our legal system, as far as I'm concerned, from empirical experience, is that the legal system, it has no integrity. Lawyers go and they lie, they connive. District attorneys, they lie and they connive to get conviction. Judges are free to do whatever they want to do. I swear for God, literally. In 90% of the courtrooms in America, the law on that day, in those moments, are based on the attitude of the judge who walks in there. You see, and who he may favor. He may favor the district attorney, the nice guy or nice girl, over the lawyer who just sits there and nags all the time about his clients. Our legal system over the last several decades has been chosen, judges have been chosen primarily by partisanship, Democrat, Republican, and I'm sure if McCain would have won, Joe Plummer would have been the judge. Having said that, thank you.
So any further questions? So if you, if there's others.
I just had a couple of clarifying questions about the facts that you're giving. The first one was, do you have the date for when it was demolished in Michigan?
It's like 1850s.
Yes.
1857.
So before 1857. I can get
Until, just so I understand, until 1998, there was no minimum age for executing children?
As far as I know, there was there's no minimum age. Obviously, it was in practice with children under a certain age, but I think for the most part,
On the
execution,
books,
there's no on the books, there's none. What you have though is in practice is around 15, 14, particularly the 14-year-old in 1944 was probably one of the youngest. But what you have is practicing greater, however, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds.
And then at 1998 to 2005, you had to be 16?
1988 to 2005. Yeah. It's,
I also wanted to point out that since New York did not abolish the death penalty, it just don't exist anymore. It's still impossible, but it doesn't exist. But the homicide rate has dropped dramatically since we've done away with the death penalty. It's crazy.
and if I can just add to that, what you have in the U.S. is you have states that have been abolished, like New Jersey, and you have states where there's a moratorium, where the death, where people, they're not executed, right? It's not being practiced.
Can you explain that process? Because different states can choose, if they're going to abolish it or keep it. I mean, can you explain that process a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I'd love to. I mean, it really deals more of a more of a procedural, functional way when it comes to abolition. Than a moratorium. I mean, moratorium has happened also. The UN has tried to also do moratoriums about practicing the death penalty. It's like a temporary stop, right?
For example, like why is New Jersey a state that's not allowed to Georgia is? Like, can you explain that process?
Lee has her hand up, so you want to speak to it.
Yeah, I'm against campaigns on the death penalty too. I mean, a moratorium can be issued by an executive order. So technically, for example, like what happened in Illinois in 2000, Governor George Ryan, very famous situation, he declared a moratorium because he was sort of compelled by overwhelming evidence of innocence and felt like there needed to be a halt. Then there's different paths to abolition. So it can be done through the courts, like Furman v. Georgia in 1972, or it can be done legislatively, like what happened in New Mexico and New Jersey. What happened in New York, the death penalty has basically been removed from the books in 2004, I think it was, basically because there was a court challenge to the statute and it was never brought back. So there's different judicial and legislative routes to go. But a moratorium, I think technically, is something that's kind of comes from executive order.
So is partly what then you guys do is then do you have like a list of like next states that you want to move towards this moratorium? Like, is that how kind of New York and abolition?
Right now, what is it? It's Delaware, Maryland, and Connecticut. In Connecticut, these are states that are right now really leaning toward abolishing the death penalty. So we see that and we focus on that state. We try to persuade the population to write petitions, to encourage their legislators to vote vote for abolition. So that's what basically anybody in Georgia. Georgia's a lynching state. You ever heard the song
Strange Fruit?
Strange Fruits by Billie Holiday? You never heard it? Well, I'll play it for you when this is over. That's one of the states.
I was just wondering like how you target the states.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's three or kind of
Yeah.
And I can talk about it from like just an amnesty perspective. We look at the way we do is kind of almost like a state map. We break up the states that we know are active, that are death penalty abolished, like New Jersey, like now Illinois. It's one of the most recent. Obviously, those are victories we count. There are states that we kind of have like watchdogs so that they don't try to bring the death penalty back, like in New York. And then you have states where, of course, we want to also get it abolished in those states as well. But for the most part, we also have states where we know that it's winnable, right, over this period of time. So like Delaware, Maryland, Connecticut, we believe are winnable states. Now, what you have, and so that we're actively working on pushing around about abolition in those states. You have on the far end of the spectrum that is, now what we're talking about is like Georgia, Texas, which has executed the most people since they brought it back, Florida, etc., Missouri. Those, to abolish the death penalty in those states is going to take a lot of work. It's a long-term struggle. Really, it's around the mobilizing work with constituents within those states, around working against building a movement of people within those states that will begin to advocate against the death penalty. That's a long-term struggle. In places like Texas, Georgia, particularly when we talk about the South, that struggle is ongoing, it's been happening for years. Eventually, we'll get to a place where we'll say that these are the states we're targeting because we know over this short period of time, it's winnable. Unfortunately, places like Texas and Georgia are not. But Georgia is very, very important. Just because I give the historical timeline for a reason, and Troy Davis' case was national and international. Georgia has always played a critical role symbolically in terms of the death penalty throughout the country. And so Georgia's going to be a very important win. I believe that I'll see Georgia abolish the death penalty in my lifetime. I'm also a hopeless romantic. So.
Is it seen as just a bad strategy at this point to work, instead of going state by state, to work on the national level to try to get it launched across the country? Or is that, are people working on that as opposed to?
There's a debate. We can get into it. Amnesty works solely right now on state by state abolition. We feel like it's winnable in ways that federal is not. At least not right now, but maybe different.
I can see it having strategic value in that if you get it in one state, you can kind of build on it and start to build a public opinion in a way that you couldn't if you set the goal.
Yeah, and then it's targeting 14th and 8th Amendment right violations.
Yeah, because it has to, in order for it to be abolished, as the House and the Senate, the House and the Senate has to abolish federal law, has to abolish it. But there's and I've told people this because when I was looking at the Troy Davis case and the Mumia Abu Jamal case, I wanted to approach it from a executive perspective. We get to the Justice Department to investigate their civil rights. And as I was reading, I'm learning that each state, although it's a part of the United States, has its own sovereignty. Right, and that Georgia at one point threatened to pull away from the Union. Yeah, literally threatened to pull away from the Union, citing its sovereignty. That's how I found out about it. However, I do think that, because of that, there's a federal death penalty. And each state has its own death penalty. If the federal government decided that it did not want the death penalty, it would only affect, it would be a constitutional, it would have to be a constitutional amendment to abolish the death penalty. And you know that's 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and that's almost impossible in this state.
And can I just add something? So in 1972, with George V. Furman, when the Supreme Court found the death penalty, use of death penalty unconstitutional, what you had is states working, like states that, like states like Georgia and Texas, they spent the next 4 years working on procedures particularly procedures that could prove that the death penalty could be applied in their state and be not arbitrary, did not have to be biased. States were, when you had people in the abolitionist movement advocating for abolition, but you had states working to bring it back. And that's why it was brought back when they brought it with Gregory, Georgia. That's how they brought it back in 1976. So what you do is strategically, what we're doing is we're working state by state, and we're working with people in these states. People to put pressure on our targets, which are state officials in that state, to put pressure to abolish death penalty. So hopefully, if there is a time when we do this federally, we'll have a lot more states. Yes. Particularly, but we have to penetrate the South. It's critical.
I already spoke to someone else wants to jump in.
I have a few questions. I'm sorry to clarify, just to be clear, so the difference between moratorium and the abolition is let's say someone is on death row, the moratorium is still there, but it's not going to be executed, provided it doesn't get unhalted, right? Whereas abolition, that person is no longer on death row, they go into that regular life.
That's essentially the legal, do you want to talk to that? And then, because he was part of this, right? Because when the death, in 1972, when George B. Furman, that's how Lawrence no longer was on death row, right? So it was abolished through the United States. But the moratoriums, you literally have people sitting in states like that are on death row that are not being executed. But let me let Lee respond to that.
I think that I just want to clarify or add to what I said a moment ago about this, because there's actual moratorium and then there's what's called it's a de facto moratorium. Like in California right now, California is the biggest death row in the country. There's over 800 people on death row. It's massive. Texas executes at a much higher rate and much higher pace, but in terms of numbers and headcount, California just is far and away the biggest. But California has a de facto moratorium because there's been legal challenges to the lethal injection protocol. And so there's actually a number of states, I'm not sure how many off the top of my head, that have what I would characterize as de facto moratoriums, which means that currently, based on legal standing, no one can be executed. Now, that doesn't mean that under those kinds of conditions, moratorium conditions, people can still be sentenced to death. Death rows can continue to grow. So California's death row has been growing. I think they've probably added dozens of people
700 and some odd people.
in between. But whereas full-on abolition means people who are on death row actually move, they're resentenced. And when Lawrence was when the death penalty was abolished and Lawrence was moved off the death row, what's very important to know, to add to this understanding, is that in 1972, life without parole as a sentence did not actually really exist. And there's some very interesting statistics about that. And so what happened, that's why Lawrence is here with us today. He wasn't given life without parole, he was given life. Whereas today, what's happened like in New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, when they got rid of the death penalty, no one even thinks twice about it. It's life without parole. There's a whole ideological thing, like, okay, there's no way they should be left out on the street. Well, Lawrence is here walking amongst us, and we're very glad of that. And that's because there wasn't a kind of thinking or approach that life without parole is an acceptable sentence. So, just to speak to that,
There's 719 people. Anywhere else, that's a massacre. There's 719 people. On Georgia's, I'm just speaking on California's. 719 people. This is the death penalty fact. This comes from the Death Penalty Information Center. 700. I mean, Jesus Christ. In total, there are 3,220 people in death houses throughout this country. That's a massacre.
It's also a factor of the racial background of who moved to death row as well. It's around 35% of them are African American, a little over 55 to 6% are white, around 7% are considered Latino, and there's about 2% that are other. But again, like I said before, the victims of those convicted of death penalty capital cases, 77% of them tend to be
I'm sorry to harp on this, but so does the whole moratorium thing mean that in New York State someone can or cannot be sentenced to death?
the death penalty statute in New York has been ruled unconstitutional.
Okay, so that's
And
not
that
even
was,
a sentence.
what's that?
It's not even a sentence.
It's not even a sentence. So the statute has not been, what it would take to bring that statute back is that the law would need to be rewritten, and it would have to be passed in the Assembly and the House and signed by the governor. And interestingly, I'm not a fan of Governor Cuomo, but Governor Cuomo was actually part of the coalition that I was part of that mobilized against it in cultural or whatever. And, we were at press conferences together and sort of helped really make this. There's no way that I don't believe Cuomo would ever sign that penalty legislation.
But life without parole.
Well, life without parole was brought back with Kentucky at the same time, and that's very, very important to understand. Life without parole and the